You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast, coming to you from Montecito, California. And today, before we begin, I'd like to remind you that there is a website associated with this podcast, and that website is wealthformula.com. It's where you go if you want to pick up some of the resources that are associated with Wealth Formula, including the ability to sign up for some of the lists, such as the accredited investor list. The year is coming to an end here. A focus in the accredited investor group will be tax mitigating type investments, so real estate and some other stuff, which are very, very powerful tools in terms of potential tax mitigation. If you are interested in getting on board and seeing what's next in that space, get onboarded. Go to wealthformula.com, sign up for the accredited investor club, and don't miss out. Only got a few months here with 60% bonus depreciation. Then it goes down to 40. So the opportunities are dwindling. Okay, so let's talk about the show today. Of course, we're talking to Jim Rickards, which was really timely because he's kind of a big guy to interview on election times, as he predicted the last couple victories for Trump. This particular interview was recorded before the election results were known, so you'll see for yourself what he had to say ahead of time. But anyway, as we know, Kamala Harris lost big on Tuesday night, and to a certain degree, it caught almost everyone off guard. Despite widespread expectations that she'd be slightly ahead going into the election, the reality turned out really different. She got crushed. And in those battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, where many assumed that she might actually have an edge, Trump surged past expectations in every one of those places. And just days before the election, the Des Moines Register poll, one of the most respected political polls in those circles, had Harris leading by 3 points in Iowa. The New York Times and Siena College polling also showed her ahead in several backgrounds, with Trump solidly up only in Georgia and Arizona. But guess what? These numbers, well, you saw it for yourself. They were way off on election day. Even in typically blue strongholds, the polling was just still way off. I mean, in Maryland, where Democrats usually don't even blink at the polls, Harris underperformed her polling average by over a percentage point, while Trump exceeded by about 4 points there. In New Jersey, obviously a traditionally very blue state, polls were wildly off the mark. Rutgers had run a poll in mid-October that missed Trump's numbers by double digits. And even the most accurate polling underestimated the gap between the two candidates by 6 points. But you know what? This actually isn't the first time polls have missed the mark by such a wide range. When were they really off before? Well, 2016. Trump won last time. Pollsters had underestimated the support for Trump because their traditional methods didn't reach what were called the silent Trump voters. The silent Trump voters, they thought, were those that were less likely to survey, to take surveys, from phone calls or respond to pollsters. Now, that same trend seems to have repeated itself in 2024, raising the question, are polling methods outdated? Now, if you go back to my interview with Zolfi from last week, I actually didn't think it was going to be close. I did not agree with these polls. Now, what do I know? I'm no Jim Rickards, right? But it seemed pretty obvious to me that, people who were wildly against Trump in previous elections were coming around to the idea that, you know what, those years that we had in the past were better than the last 4. I like the policies better. Something's got to change. And I'm not scared of Trump like I used to be. And you see widespread support for Trump in a lot of circles that you didn't see before. Elon Musk, for example, 3 years ago was still a Democrat, right? And you have a number of fairly mainstream individuals who came out for Trump. None of that was happening. So to me, it seemed kind of obvious. And then I don't know if you guys listen to like Joe Rogan. I sometimes do, but Joe Rogan had him on, and there was huge numbers of views there, and a very positive interview for Trump. He did really well for 3 hours, and Kamala didn't even accept Rogan's invitation to come on for that full 3 hours. She said she'd only do it if he came out to Washington, D.C. for 45 minutes and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, the things that people actually pay attention to every day, the ordinary people, the shows they watch, the people they listen to, and all that, to me seemed sort of overwhelmingly favorable for Donald Trump. And that's why I thought it was going to not be close. I thought Trump was going to win by a significant margin. And as it turns out, he did. But mine was completely based on sort of like, licking the tip of my finger and putting it up in the air and trying to understand which way the air was blowing. And that's obviously, supposed to be a lot less scientific. But in the reality, I don't know how scientific these polls actually really are. And it makes me think that maybe they should move to some other kind of method of trying to predict these elections if they need to do so anyway. And one of the thoughts was, well, maybe they should be engaging like artificial intelligence. They could be looking at an enormous amounts of data in real time. They could be looking at shifts in demographics. They could be looking at social media sentiment. I mean, they could be looking at, the what people are listening to in vast numbers, like the, Joe Rogan show and the All In podcast, where Trump did extremely well. They could be listening to prominent people in Silicon Valley who in a million years would have never been behind Trump in 2016 and 2020 that were behind him this time around. So to me, it seemed like, if they had done something other than, call random people who were going to answer the phone and answer questions, they might have gotten a different picture. So artificial intelligence, I think you have found another place that you can potentially be beneficial. Now, again, I didn't think, I thought it was going to be a landslide, and so did the guy I'm interviewing today, Jim Rickards. And he also predicted it in 2016, which in my opinion was actually kind of a bigger shock than it was in 2024 by far and away. I mean, I think 2016, Trump himself didn't think he was going to win that one. So, but Jim Rickards did. And he's always got a unique perspective on pretty much everything. He's a very smart guy, multiple times a New York Times bestselling author, great writer, by the way. Just as an aside, very, when you read his books, it's very, very engaging and easy to read. So I highly recommend his book. And he's he and I talk about elections. We talk about polls, why they get it wrong. And then ultimately we move into the topic that he's been really particularly interested in, which is artificial intelligence and its role in the economy, the markets, and national security. Anyway, great show coming up for you right after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Jim Rickards. Jim's been on the show before. He's a New York Times bestselling author and economist. He's the editor of Strategic Intelligence, which is a financial newsletter, and he's also the author of multiple books, which I highly recommend. There's the 2016, The Road to Ruin. There was The New Great Depression in 2021, Sold Out in 2022, and the latest book, which we're going to talk about today, is Money, GPT, AI, and the Threat to the Global Economy. Welcome back, Jim.
Thanks, Buck. It's great to be with you.
Before we get to that AI stuff, I wanted to ask you about something, which is, well, when I first started following you, and I believe it was maybe back in 2015 and 16. Anyway, it was election day for the 2016 election, and I was watching you, and you had an update there that said that even though a lot of people didn't think that this was going to happen, in fact, pretty much no one did, you predicted a Trump victory. Of course, it was obvious that in hindsight that you seemed to pick up on something that a lot of people didn't. And so I'm wondering, on the eve
Right.
of the election here, what are your insights about what's going on today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Trump's going to win. I did do that in 2016. I was on Bloomberg. We were live. It was before the election, and Christine Locke was the host. She's a very bright lady. They had me and another guest. They asked the other guest, and he said, yeah, he said, when Bill Clinton got elected, we were all in bed by 10 o'clock at night because it was over really quickly. He said, now we'll be in bed even sooner. This election is going to be Hillary, and it'll be over by like 9:30. And then she turned to me and said, what do you think? I said, Trump's going to win. And she was like taken aback. She was kind of nonplussed. And she goes, well, is that because the polls are wrong or turnouts are? I said, both. Actually, both of those things are true. And I explained them. So, okay, here we are, 8 years later, 2024. Trump's going to win. It's at worst for him, it'll be close, but there's a chance that he picks up some states, and I would say New Hampshire, New Mexico, Virginia. I'm not calling those states for Trump. I'm saying that in addition to the battlegrounds, those are states that he might win. So you could even be looking at an electoral college landslide. But I think he'll have at a minimum a comfortable margin, maybe 290 to uh, 220, whatever the residual is after to get to 535.
So if it ends up being a landslide, what is it that they're missing? When they're projecting essentially like a razor thin margin and, plus minus Harris winning, they're projecting a dead heat. If I wasn't looking at the polls, I would tend to think that what you're saying is actually the case, because I'm talking to people, friends who are even very anti-Trump last couple rounds, but they've gone through a presidency and they've looked at, the world didn't blow up, and that maybe that they actually like some of his policies. And they think, well, I'd rather have Donald Trump than Kamala Harris as my president. Maybe they just won't tell anybody. But, I feel like that's a big factor here. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. That is a factor. They call it the hidden Trump vote or the shy Trump vote. But basically, they're people who support Trump, but they want to keep their heads down. They just, they don't want to be picked on or yelled at. And the Democrats and the progressives they're pretty aggressive. And so you have your opinion, but just kind of keep your head down a little bit. There's another Trump voter who just won't participate in the polls. They get the phone calls or the text messages. We all get them, I guess, but they won't respond. So that's not even about keeping your head down. That's just about not participating in the polling system. And I've written some long articles on this. People take the polls at face value. You really have to look behind the curtain and say, okay, first thing, how big was your sample size? If you're 1,300 or higher, okay, nice job. That's a pretty good sample. I saw one that had Harris up 6 points in one of the states, but the margin of error was 6 points because they only had 400 respondents. I said, well, great. So she's ahead by 6 points with a 6 point margin of error. That means zero. So, and then the other thing is, let's say a sample population is 40% Democrat, 40% Republicans. This is say as a hypothetical. Well, if they poll 45% Democrats, 35% Republicans, the rest independent, they're obviously going to get a favorable result for the Democrats. If you oversample the Democrats, you're going to have more better results for the Democrats. That's obvious, but they don't tell you about the oversampling. So between the small sample size, the oversampling, framing the questions, and a lot else, oversampling, it could be women or African Americans, whatever. You can those results are skewed. Now, if you know everything I just said and you're familiar with statistics, you can kind of reverse engineer it and get back to something closer to the truth. But I look at the best pollsters, the ones with the best track record, are Barris, Trafalgar, Rasmussen's very good, and there are a couple others, but I wouldn't rely very much on the New York Times. So I think all those factors you mentioned are in play. But there's a bigger one that is the most important of all and is almost impossible to measure, which is turnout. Meaning, like, you can slice and dice the population, men versus women, college versus non-college, Latinos, Africans, blacks, etc. You can slice that. When you look at the slices, one group may favor Harris more than Trump, or vice versa, or maybe Harris has, let's say, 50% of the Latino vote, but Obama had 60% of the Latino vote or 70%. So Trump's doing better in those groups. That's interesting, it's good data, but you still have to ask, the question, which is who's showing up? Who's actually gonna vote? So having all that information doesn't ask the biggest question of all, which is what's the turnout? To the extent that we can judge a little bit from mail-in votes and early voting, which is relatively new, looks like turnout is very high in Trump areas, meaning more specifically rural areas, and is lower in urban areas, which tend to favor Harris. So that's another signal that Trump's going to win.
Well, I know you've talked about this election stuff all day long, so I want to focus a little bit on your new book. You've expressed some concerns, I guess, in terms of AI and the economy, and others have as well. Obviously, your takes are always unique, so I'm wondering, what was the impetus behind this book in the first place?
Well, you go back a couple of years to the introduction of a Chat GPT in particular. AI has been around since the 50s. You could say that Frankenstein's creature from Mary Shelley in the 19th century was AI. So it goes back a long way, but really it's science. It goes back to the 1950s. So that's not really new. The thing that burst on the scene in 2022 was GPT-4 from OpenAI. This was basically GPT generative pre-trained transformers. It's the kind of AI that if you give it a question, it'll give you an answer. It'll produce an essay. It could write a book. I should issue a disclaimer. I wrote my own book. I didn't. It wasn't written by a computer, but so that's what was new. It had, like, I think 200 million downloads in 60 days, something the fastest take up of any app in history, etc. So and then the stock market took off. So Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, OpenAI is private, but they're coming along. That all took off. So obviously the topic was red hot. And I have a very good relationship with my publisher, Penguin Random House, and my editor, Nikki. And one question she asked me when I came up with the idea, she said, "Okay, Jim, great idea. Sounds like a really good topic for a book. How do we know that a year and a half from now, when the book comes out, it will still be topical?" I said, "Nikki, I guarantee it. This thing is not going away. It'll be bigger than ever." And that has turned out to be the case. AI is an even bigger story today than it was when we started. So, but just to be clear and kind of answer the question specifically, Buck, AI can apply to almost anything. You open your refrigerator and there's a light that says, change the water filter. Well, that's the AI. It's like monitoring the water filter and it has a clock and it's telling you what to do. It's on the dashboard of your car, Alexa, Siri. AI is everywhere. So this is not a book about things that are coming. There are things that are already here, but we're looking at the dangers that are not well understood, number one. But and it's not an AI. I'm not bashing AI. I mean, for example, in the field of medicine, it can look at molecular structures and come up with combinations that correlate to certain outcomes, and it can discover drugs that humans, in theory, they could do, but like a room full of really smart humans working for years on end wouldn't be able to look at as many molecular combinations as a computer can with AI algorithms and fast processors. So it'll do a lot of good. But I do two things. Number one, I stay in my lanes, which are capital markets, banking, and national security. So those are my areas of expertise. When I talk about AI in that context, I'm not really talking about biochemistry, although it can probably do a lot of good there. The other thing is I'm not bashing AI, but I'm warning people. I'm saying, look, there are hidden dangers here, and I explain what they are and how they work, how they could play out, and what people can do about them. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not bashing it, but I'm saying, there's a lot of danger here that people aren't aware of, and you should be if you're an investor in markets.
What is the fallacy of composition?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I spent a lot of time on that in the book. It's kind of a fancy name for a phenomena where people can do something that benefits an individual, and that's fine and may be sensible. But if everybody does it, it's catastrophic. So, in other words, things that work at a small scale can fail at a much larger scale. So, a really simple example, let's say you're at a football game and you don't have a great view. So you stand up and you go, that's great. Now I can see the whole field. It really looks good. But what happens? The person behind you, they stand up, person behind her stands up. And next thing you know, the whole stadium's on their feet. Nobody's better off. Everybody's worse off because you're all standing up. And so there's an example where something that suits an individual fails at scale. Now let's apply that to the stock markets. So let's say you've got a market crash, which happened all the time. I mean, March 2020, stock market fell 30% in 1 month. That was not the biggest crash in history, but it was the fastest crash of that size in history. And what do you do? I mean, making money is fine, but you have to avoid losing money at the same time. And both things are important. So in a situation like that, an individual might say, okay, I don't know what's going on. It looks bad. I don't want to lose money. I'm going to sell my stocks, go to cash, go to the sidelines, wait it out, and I'll come back in once things calm down. That's a perfectly good strategy for an individual. But what happens if everybody sells? Everybody's selling with no buyers. In that world, prices go straight down. They go through the floor. You blow through circuit breakers, and you might actually have to close the markets. So a strategy that works well for an individual is catastrophic at a large scale. Now, that phenomenon has been around forever. That's an old behavioral problem. But now let's introduce AI. What's the difference? A couple of things. Number one, more and more investment managers, hedge funds, and others, they're basically enabling AI to do the trade for them. They're not even getting advice and then making a decision. They're telling AI, go ahead and just do it. You're pre-programmed to do the trade. Number one. Number two, they're all programmed the same way, and this is really the problem, which is you've got engineers and developers who can do exactly what I said. Markets down 5%, sell half, down 10%, sell the other half, etc. But they're all the same. There's no originality in this. And so basically the whole market has been decision making to a great extent has been outsourced to AI, and AI programs are all the same. They're all using the same training sets, the same algorithms. So they're going to take this phenomenon of all sellers, no buyers, which I described, but accelerate it and amplify it in a way that will be completely out of control. So that's the danger.
Yeah, I mean, you've basically got a bunch of people who've already got automatic sell orders in place. And then as you sort of, get into this artificial intelligence world, it sort of takes it just to the next level of complexity, right? What are the implications of that to our banking system?
Well, it's a great question because you have to distinguish between the capital markets and stock markets on the one hand, and banking and finance on the other. They're two different worlds. They obviously intersect, but they're different things. So in the banking world, it's even more dangerous. Stocks go down, that's bad. You lose money. Maybe the markets have to close for a period of time until you can get things back under control. But when banks fail, you're talking about taking down the entire economy. It's not just losing money on bank stocks. It's about losing the capacity to create credit. People always talk about the Fed printing money. Okay, but the Fed printing money is almost irrelevant because they print the money by buying securities. They give the money to the banks. The banks take the money and give it back to the Fed as excess reserves. That money doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't do anything. You're just inflating the Fed's balance sheet. Commercial banks are the ones who create the money that actually drive the economy. And if you have sequential bank failures, that will basically hitting the off switch on the total economy. So we all, but again, the dynamics are the same. So, Buck, we've all seen grainy black and white pictures of the 1930s, and mostly men with overcoats and fedoras lined up outside around the bank in the rain, trying to get their money out of the bank. Of course, it's too late for them. The insiders already took the money, but that is a run on the bank. Well, take that in the 21st century with AI, and what do we have? We have the same phenomena, but it happens at lightning speed and in scale. Like you can you don't have to stand in line. Take your iPhone, tap a few buttons, and wire the money, to a different account or a different bank or a different investment, et cetera, and then text your friend, "Hey, get out before it's too late." This is happening at, as I say, the speed of light. It's even faster than that because a lot of programs are pre-programmed to do that without even being told. And so you have the same. What you have is the intersection of human behavior and automation. So they kind of merge. The human behavior hasn't changed throughout civilization. I could point to 14th century financial panics, but the acceleration effect of the AI and the extent to which we've outsourced our decision making to AI, that's where the danger is. And so you could have a very rapid flash crash of banks, not unlike what we talked about in the stock market.
The other thing you're interested in, which I think is obviously very important and we're worried about, is the role of AI in national security. And when I think about AI, one of the things that scares me personally is it sort of levels the playing field for bad guys, right? AI is available to everybody pretty much, and it's not terribly expensive. So putting that kind of power in the hands of the bad guys, regardless of their resources, that seems like a problem. In other words, you don't need to be a super rich country necessarily to start acting like one. You've got the same technology to do the same kind of damage. Is that one of the concerns?
That's one of the concerns, and one of two, and I'll talk about both of them. Yeah, and in chapter one, which is the market meltdown scenario we talked about, the book's nonfiction, but I come up with a scenario, a story, if you will, to explain how this could happen. And I have a number of characters. One guy's he's a wealthy family office manager. Two other guys are hedge fund traders, but they're master market manipulators. They're trying to crash the markets. There's a Chinese cyber warfare unit that's trying to do the same thing. We've got central bankers and other participants in the scenario I described. And it uses the manipulators use deep fakes, which if I gave you 10,000 hours of videotape of Jay Powell, there's software you can buy off the shelf that could create Jay Powell walking and talking, speaking, saying whatever you want, completely artificial intelligence generated, but that would be very convincing, but not the real Jay Powell. So anyway, I have a whole scenario where the manipulators are trying to crash the markets, the Chinese are trying to crash the markets, the manipulators are using deep fakes to basically lie to the market about what the Fed's going to do, et cetera. So that's the scenario. But it basically all revolves around artificial intelligence. But I make the point: there's no mastermind in this scenario. In the scenario I'm giving, the Chinese cyber hackers are not talking to the market manipulators. The market manipulators are not talking to the family office. The family office is not talking to the Fed. Nobody's in charge. Everyone's acting either uh, in a good way or a criminal way, in their own interests. But again, the interaction, the complex dynamic, and the accelerating effect of AI that causes this meltdown. So that's one example where you can basically introduce deepfakes and market manipulation, hack order entry systems, et cetera, and sync markets. At least from the Chinese case, it is a kind of warfare. It's basically financial warfare. Now jump over to pure national security case. I have a chapter on nuclear warfighting. And I've studied that since the late 1960s. A lot of the great works on that were actually written in the late 1950s and early 1960s by people like Albert and Roberta Wohlstetter, Paul Nitze, Henry Kissinger. But the big brain of that group was Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn basically said the way a nuclear war will start, he said, no, nobody wakes up on a nice day and says, "Hey, good day for a nuclear war. I think I'll fire a missile." That's not how it happens. What happens is it happens through escalation. One side provokes the other side responds. The first side raises the ante, and you keep going up, and whatever confrontation is getting worse and worse, more and more tense. You're on an escalatory ladder. It's like you're climbing up a ladder, And Kahn described it. He even had, I believe, 54 steps or however many steps in this ladder. But you're heading for nuclear war. Now, what do you do about that? So Kahn said what you have to do is, first of all, recognize the dynamic you're in. Recognize the fact that you're on an escalatory ladder, number one. Number two, take a beat and then start to climb down. De-escalate. Steer away from the nuclear war. And that is what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And by the way, we're in two situations today, the world, Ukraine and the Middle East. I don't have to debate. We don't have to take sides on that. That's a separate, talk about that in the bar. But both wars are on an escalatory path with nuclear powers involved, whether it's US, Russia, Israel, maybe Iran, Pakistan, and others. So we're on that escalatory path today. Now, in the classic case, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro, Khrushchev and Kennedy did, in fact, de-escalate. But less well known, there are two cases in the 1980s. One is the KGB was using a very early form of artificial intelligence, and they were looking at the United States, the Soviet Union, basically Russia, on a whole variety of factors and ranking them. And they said, the U.S. is ahead of the Soviet Union, but they were looking at the spread, and they said when the U.S. gets sufficiently far ahead of the Soviet Union, like on a 70 to 30 ratio instead of 50-50, that the U.S. would launch a first strike. We would feel sufficiently secure and superior to launch a first strike. And of course, the first thing you learn about nuclear warfighting, if you think the other guy's going to shoot at you, you fire first, because there's an advantage to that. So this thing was sort of primed for nuclear war. A couple of things happened. Number one, there was another Soviet AI system called codename OKO, and this lieutenant colonel was operating it, and he got an alert that incoming U.S. missiles were incoming. The U.S. missiles were attacking the Soviet Union, and he got a launch warning. And the Soviet policy was launch on warning, meaning when you get the warning, you launch first. His job was to call his superiors, tell him that he had got the signal, and leave it to them, and they very likely would have fired nuclear missiles. But he had worked on the system. He knew it had flaws. And he saw 5 missiles coming in. He said, the U.S. wouldn't fire 5 missiles, they would fire 200. So he inferred on his own initiative that it must be a false alarm. He disobeyed orders. He did not call his superiors. They did not start a nuclear war. And he became later known as the man who saved the world.
And I think because he didn't act, he actually lost his job or maybe even his life, didn't he?
No, he could have. My point, he was betting his life and his country on the fact that he was right.
Right.
And there was another case where the U.S. and NATO were conducting a war game, but the war game scenario was a nuclear attack. We were doing that. The KGB was watching it, and they didn't know it was a war game. They thought it was, we were using a war game as a cover for an actual attack. And they were getting ready. They were mobilizing the weapons, getting bombers on the runways, getting the missiles ready for launch, etc. And there was a lieutenant general, General Perutz in the U.S. Army, who saw this happening. And again, on his own initiative, against orders, he ordered the war game to step back, to scale it down a little bit and stop going down the path. The Soviets picked up on it. They de-escalated, and they came in for a soft landing. But what do those two cases have in common? We were heading for nuclear war, and humans stopped it. But how did they do it? It was gut instinct, intuition, and guesswork, really intelligent guesswork. Basically, it was something that you cannot program. May actually be non-programmable. So computers can deal with what's called deductive logic, where you have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. It can be wrong if the premise is wrong, but the process is logical. This goes back to Aristotle. Then there's inductive logic, which is basically from observations. If you see something everywhere, you say, well, that's the way it is. It must be true other places. That's induction. It works until you get like a black swan. It took Europeans a long time to get to Adelaide, Australia, and find the black swans, the real ones. But the point is, computers can do deductive logic and they can do inductive logic. But there's a third kind of logic called abductive logic. It started with Charles Sanders Peirce in the 19th century. The guy was 100 years ahead of his time. problem with guys like that is it takes 100 years to figure out that they were right. But without getting into doing a deep dive on abductive logic, it's basically a fancy word for common sense, intuition, exactly what I was talking about in those two nuclear warfighting scenarios. You cannot program it. It has never, intuition has never been programmed. Um, Guesswork is maybe non-programmable. You can't duplicate or replicate that aspect of human intelligence. And so my advice is to the Pentagon, if they're listening, keep AI out of the nuclear kill chain. Do not put AI in that kill chain because AI lacks the intuition and the common sense we just talked about, doesn't know how to de-escalate, and will drive you up the ladder towards nuclear war. So just keep it out of the nuclear warfight. Unfortunately, China is going ahead with it, probably Russia as well, and the US will feel we have to do it too to keep up, but you're creating a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, so I guess the concern there is that we're relying too much on it and taking out the intuition elements that keep us from, from going too far, like Kennedy pushing the button in the Cuban Missile Crisis, or some of the other examples that you gave. What about the threats from abroad that artificial intelligence creates? Maybe those weren't quite as easy before. Are those things that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be concerned about, deep fakes and, I don't know, disinformation, whatever they call it. I think disinformation, whenever people disagree with you, they say it's disinformation. They don't actually want to have a debate. Um, there are threats from abroad, but they tend to be, you can kind of spot them and contain them, particularly in the political realm. The much greater danger, Buck, is what I talk about in chapter 5, which is from within, from basically censorship, bias, and confabulation, which is just a fancy word for lying, coming from inside the United States, specifically Facebook, Google, Microsoft, I would say Twitter before Elon Musk bought it, etc. These are the gatekeepers on AI. When you download Gemini or ChatGPT, which that comes from OpenAI, um, Microsoft had one called Bing. I mean, they're kind of coming out with new ones all the time. When you download those, you're making those companies the gatekeepers on GPT. And let me give you a very concrete example. What I'm talking about. Uh, Google had an AI system called Gemini, and you could download it. And it was not to say I was GPT, which is a branch of AI, and that's the one you can give it a prompt, which is just a question, and it'll give you an answer, either an image or an essay. It'll write a college term paper, whatever you want it to do. They actually do it. Not very good, by the way, but they can do it. So somebody using Gemini said, "Give me an image of a pope." And the machine came back with an image of women and papal vestments and a shaman. Um, and then kept going. He said, "Well, give me an image of a Viking." And it came back with a black Viking. Well, I'm a Catholic. I know there have been 266 popes, and they were all men. There's never been a woman pope. Again, you can debate women in the church. That's a separate. We'll take that discussion to the bar. I'm just saying that the thing was wrong. And if you've been to Scandinavia, they're all fair skinned and blonde. So there are no black Vikings. It never happened.
Right, except, of course, the Minnesota Vikings NFL team.
Right. So people say, well, the system malfunctioned. And I'm like, no, it did not malfunction. It functioned exactly as intended. So what's behind the curtain? Well, the answer is something called prompt injection. And prompt injection means, so you give it a prompt, that's your question. You say, show me a picture of a pope, and it comes back as a woman. Well, what happens is it was programmed to say, give me a picture of a pope in a world of DEI where everybody has an equal chance to settle. Well, if you ask that question, you'll get a female pope or a black Viking. The point is, the engineers are taking a very simple declarative type question and adding to it their own bias.
Yeah.
And so the system actually worked based on the prompt injection, but you don't know about the injection part. You don't know what's going on behind the curtain. And why are they doing that at all? Well, the answer is they have a bias against bias. In other words, bias is part of human nature. It's probably why we're still here after a million years. So bias is actually a good thing. It helps us survive. So let's say I'm a hunter. I'm trying to feed my family in Paleolithic Europe, and I have a very strong bias against saber-toothed tigers. I never want to see one. Well, that's probably a good thing. Probably keeps me alive, and I can feed my family. But they're biases also. And we know what they are, racism and sexism and other kinds of things. They're bad. No one's defending them. They are part of human nature. So, but what the engineers at Google and say Facebook and OpenAI and others are doing, they're trying to erase that bias. They're going into the training set and trying to scrub it out or using prompt injection to filter it out, etc. There are a couple problems with that. Number one, this is Orwellian. This is Big Brother. I'm not defending the bias. There are some bad biases, but they're real. And so if you don't see them reflected in the output, you're not getting reality. You're getting a version of reality, number one. Number two, they're substituting their own bias for the other bias. Who's to say that their bias is any better? Who's to say that their bias is any more, correct? Remember Google when they started their motto was "Don't be evil." Where'd that go? So my point is, it's much better. I talked to Gilman Louie. He's the number one guy in this field, a very successful career in Silicon Valley, but also a very high-ranking official in the intelligence community. Gilman ran In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA has their own venture capital firm, believe it or not, because they're trying to get access to the best ideas. And they funded an AI project that I did some years ago called Project Prophecy. So I've actually been working in this field for a long time. So I know him. We had a nice chat out at a conclave in Santa Fe. And he agreed with me that the answer is not to erase the bias. How do you deal with bad biases? Education, debate, conversation, counter it, etc. You don't erase it or pretend it's not there. You counter it with good arguments. And that requires education and critical thinking, which sometimes seem to be in short supply. But that is not what's going on. What's going on is they're trying to manipulate the training materials and substitute one bias for the other. So you get those kind of results that I was talking about. There was one guy, he gave it a prompt, he gave GPT a prompt, and he said, "I'd like a biography of," and put his own name in it. Basically, give me my own biography, but the computer doesn't know he's the guy. So the computer, whatever, spins its wheels, goes through the training sets, whatever, and produced a really good biography. Like, he was born such and such a time, went to these schools, had these sports, all this. He got to the end and said he died in 2019, and the guy's still alive. So he's like, "Well, what did he die of?" And the computer came back, "Well, he died of this, et cetera." It turns out that the guy was the obituary writer for the Daily Mail. And so his name was on 1,000 obituaries because he wrote them. So the computer sees his name with all his obituaries and says, "Well, he must be dead." So they basically wrote that into his biography. But that's an example of how the logic of the computer gives you a completely wrong result, even though the computer itself is following some rules, clouds of words and words in association with other words, etc. And I make the point that if you're a subject matter expert and you get some garbage output of the kind I described, you'll probably know it. You'll say, "Hey, that's not right." Or I give this paper a C minus or whatever. You'll know it. But what if you're not? What if you're a student? What if you're not in your subject area? What if you don't know and you're relying on GPT to give you a straight answer? It will lie to you or mislead you, and you won't even know it.
Yeah, interesting. I think like people who've been on Chat GPT for various things have probably experienced this to a certain extent already. But at scale, it can create a real problem, and I think that's the real issue. Like, if
Yeah.
Chat GPT makes up a little lie about you, it's not the end of the world. But if it's making decisions about national security, that's another thing altogether.
Right. Exactly.
Anyway, fascinating stuff, Jim. I really do appreciate your time. And I know you're on a schedule, especially people are wanting to hear from you about this election all day long. And I know you've already been on Fox today. So anyway, the book again is Money, GPT, AI, and the Threat to Global Economy. The release date is November 12th. Thanks so much for being on, Jim. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. And yes, indeed, Jim Rickards was right about that result. And I am hopeful that the next 4 years are a time for. I mean, I hope if they are as good as the last time Trump was president in terms of the real estate market and business in general, I am excited. So the crypto markets, by the way, really jumped right after the Trump victory. Even it was funny. I was texting people and I was texting them pictures of the cryptocurrency market moving with every electoral point that was recorded. But let's keep our fingers crossed, folks. And I do think that it's going to be economically, hopefully, a great 4 years. Start making sure that you start deploying some capital if you have not yet, because boy, I think these markets across the board are going to take off. That's it for me today on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.